What you're hearing here in Rachelle and in Lorretta and in Clay, you're hearing a living history that we may not ever again have the opportunity to do. And I think it's important to dwell on it in Black History Month, which is American history. If we don't tell these oral histories of who we are and what has happened, we're not going to have it to tell.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
Welcome to Union Talk and happy Black History Month. I'm your host, Randi Weingarten, and today we have one of the most special segments that we've had, which is dedicated to Bayard Rustin. Yes, he is someone that many of us at the AFT have known for generations. But more important than that, he embodies the spirit, and this film depicts his spirit. The spirit of an angelic troublemaker, the spirit of someone who had to hide so much of who he was and still found ways, particularly in the envisioning and the execution of the March on Washington, to be hugely consequential in not only Black history, but in American history. And so what we want to do today is we are doing this podcast in the 24-hour period that we have our AFT Executive Council, and we have members in this audience from the NAACP, from the AFT, from the Albert Shanker Institute, from the Image Awards, people from Netflix. We got a lot of people in the room. But today, what we really want to do is actually talk to some people who knew Bayard personally, as well as people who were so involved in the film and the screenwriting of the film, and really kind of pull the curtain back a little bit about the man and about who he was and how he became such a consequential leader of our movement and so consequential for the AFT as well. So it's a little different than the way others have looked at Rustin, but what I would hope is that anybody who listens to the podcast, there's lots of screenings. We'll be doing some more screenings as well as the AFT. Watch this film. Watch this film. Watch this film. So, the panel. Dr. Lorretta Johnson is the Secretary-Treasurer Emeritus of the AFT. For anyone who knows her, I don't have to speak about her legendary nature because you know who she is. She's a civil rights leader. She's a labor organizer. She starts from Baltimore, Maryland, and she served as AFT Vice President for over 30 years. She served as our treasurer for the AFT for 9 years. But most importantly, she created huge opportunity for paraprofessionals and support personnel in her home state, her beloved state of Maryland, and throughout the country. Thank you, Lorretta, for being here. I'm going to introduce Rachelle last. We have with us, to my immediate left, for people who are in the room, Clayola Brown, who has served as the president of A. Philip Randolph Institute since 2004. This was the organization that was founded by Bayard, and Bayard served as its first president, named for the iconic labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, who Bayard knew very well and who worked closely with Bayard. What Clay has done with the A. Philip Randolph Institute is it's not simply an institute that remembers, but it's an institute that acts over and over again to ensure that we have equity in this nation, which is getting harder and harder, but the kind of work that the AFL Randolph Institute has done in terms of getting out the vote and the engagement with communities across the country is pretty remarkable. I love that Clayola is here with us today. Thank you, Clay. There is never a movie without a screenwriter. Writers bring movies to life. And we are really honored that the author of the original screenplay for Rustin, Julian Breece, is here with us today. He is an award-winning, Emmy-nominated writer, and we need to have this shout-out to our fellow siblings in the Writers Guild. Thank you, Julian, for this movie and for being here today. I told you I would introduce Rachelle last, so let me also introduce, just like you can't have a movie without a writer, movies don't get produced without fantastic producers. And we have one of the best here. And he is a brilliant storyteller. He's an Oscar-winning filmmaker. He's made a whole bunch of other films that elevate the stories of LGBTQ plus folks. It's been a cornerstone of his work. Films like Milk, Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, and American Beauty. And now, frankly, I think it's your best, Bruce Rustin. So I want to introduce Bruce Cohen. And last is someone who, for those of us in AFT world, frankly needs no introduction. Just like Lorretta needs no introduction in the AFT world. But it is really a great honor to have Rachelle Horowitz with us tonight. Now, Rachelle, this is what I'm supposed to say about her. She's a veteran organizer. She's an incredible strategist. She lent her voice and her moxie and her blood, sweat, and tears to the civil rights movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s. She worked directly, as anyone who sees the film knows, directly with Bayard. She will tell you she was pretty accurately depicted in the film. The March on Washington would not have happened without her. But what she also has done is that she lent all of that smarts and all of that strategy to the AFT afterwards. Al Shanker had the brilliant idea to bring Rachelle in as political director for the AFT. And frankly, the AFT would not be where it is today without Rachelle Horowitz. She was the brilliant strategist that helped create the kind of foundational work that we now build off of. And so to see her depicted in the role that she had in the march, that she and Sandy would talk about over drinks for all those years since that time, it's pretty remarkable to bring that history forward with the focus on what we need to do today and tomorrow. So, thank you all of you for joining us tonight. I want to start with Julian and Bruce for a minute, because many of us know the history, but why did you decide to do this film? You have lifted him up in a way that is beautiful and in a way that where his memory can no longer be reduced to a footnote. So why'd you decide to do it?
It had to be done. It had to be done. I think, for me, my journey with Bayard and his story started when I was young, when I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up, went to school very close. I went to Jefferson Junior High School, Banneker High School. Jefferson was very close to the monument grounds. We would have celebrations every year about the March on Washington. I thought I knew everything about the March on Washington. And when I learned about Bayard, I was about 13 years old. And it was a time in my life when I was just sort of coming to terms with the fact that this gay thing was not just a phase, that it was going to stick around. And I was just looking for other signs of life out there, Black gay men whose lives showed there were positive outcomes for men like me. And there was an activist and writer, Keith Boykin, who had a blog where he would document queer histories. Black queer histories. And one of those was Bayard Rustin. And the thing that struck me immediately about Bayard's story was his relationship with King. So here you have the most celebrated religious leader, religious figure in modern history who was mentored by this brilliant Black gay man, mentored, friend. This is the person who introduced him to, nonviolent philosophy. And I couldn't believe, the thing that he's known the most for. So that changed me in that moment, just with reading that on the internet. And obviously, I learned a lot more about him, through college. Then, when the movie opportunity came along, I found out that Dustin Lance Black was going to be developing a film about Bayard Rustin. At the time, I was temping in LA. I'd come out here for film school. I really had not made a dime in the industry, but I'd written a couple of fancy screenplays that were okay, but they won some fancy awards. And so I had representation, but hadn't gotten a gig yet. When my manager told me about this, that this was happening, I was like, it has to be me. I was like, I want to be a part of it. And I think the reason why I wanted to be a part of it is because, I don't know, I felt like I felt a closeness to him, and I just wanted to make sure that there were certain parts of his story that were protected and respected, not exploited. Also, I think the most important thing that I did learn through my research about Bayard, and I think is really important in this time now of focus on individuals, the influencer, the billionaire, is that as much as the movie and Bayard's story is about him, his message is always about the collective. Yeah. And so for me going into the movie, I think that I knew that that was important. It was as much about Bayard Rustin as it was a love letter to organizers and the people who worked with him, because that is who he lifted up. Bayard was not about me. And so, I sent Lance a long email, stalked him. My manager, stalked him and told him how much Bayard meant to me. And we met. He was familiar with the short film that I had done, and we hit it off. And that was my first job in the as a feature screenwriter in the industry 10 years ago, mind you. Sorry, it was 2013. So it took 10 years for it to actually get made. That was when it all started for me.
Let me start just by saying that I'm just going to speak for Julian and I here for a moment, how honored we are to be a part of this. One of the great joys and incredible rewards of getting to do films like this about real people is that you then get to meet the living history behind them. And I've been very fortunate to have a deep connection to Randy through Sharon and a deep connection to Rachelle through my dad, who we may hear a little bit about later. But so I already were in awe of you two, but to meet Lorretta and Clayola, these icons of activism, just bursting with pride and gratefulness to be here in the space with the four of you amazing women. I had seen a documentary about Bayard Rustin. There's a great documentary about him called Brother Outsider that I had seen in the 90s. And so I knew who Bayard was and knew that not enough other people did. And I had worked with Lance Black on Milk, and he had mentioned to me at some point that he was working on a screenplay for Rustin. And I said, oh my goodness, please, if you ever get the urge to send that to me, that's something that I'd love to be a part of. And he sent me the screenplay that he and Julian had worked on. And I immediately had the sense that it would be a calling to try and get the film made. And one of the things that Bayard Rustin had in common with Harvey Milk is that when we started making the Milk film, no one knew who Harvey was. It's one of the lasting legacies of the film is that not entirely the movie, but the movie played a large part in changing that. People know who Harvey Milk is now. He's got a postage stamp. He's got a terminal named after him in San Francisco. He's got an aircraft carrier, and he's taught in history books. And none of us should rest until the same thing is true of Bayard Rustin.
Could he have an antique African art instead of an aircraft carrier? He was a pacifist.
Exactly. I think that's the sacred mission of the film and moving forward is that people will know who Bayard Rustin is and that his legacy will last and he will not get lost in history. And when after Lance sent me the script and I came on board to produce, as I was taking the script around Hollywood, we were learning the full extent of how absolutely no one knew who this man was. And I do remember thinking, well, I know one person who knows who Bayard Rustin is. And the person I was thinking of is the person that had presented Bayard Rustin with the Presidential Medal of Freedom on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And that was, at the time, President Barack Obama. And in a beautiful twist of fate, the Obamas had opened their production company at Netflix to make film and television about a month before I had gotten the script. So I thought, I'm going to send this to the Obamas. And sent it to Tonya Davis, who runs the company there. And they were looking for their first film, and when Tonya had the meeting, which she thought it was going to be the beginning of a long process to help them decide which of many movies they might make for their first film, when she mentioned Rustin, President Obama said, well, that's our first movie right there.
So the other three people on the panel, they, in different ways, Bayard is not a historical artifact to them. They knew the man and they worked with him. And so I just want, who am I to call on these three women who are all my mentors? These are all people who knew Bayard intimately. So the question I have for you, Rachelle, first is, how did you meet? And how did you get into being the transportation director of the March on Washington?
I was a young radical socialist, and I was a 16-year-old hippie, and I went to school with somebody named Tom Kahn, who's in the movie, and we thought we were going to change the world. I mean, we were going to make revolutions, I don't know where, but certainly we made a revolution in Hungary. We made a revolution in Czechoslovakia. We made a lot of revolutions in our heads and in a small room on 14th Street. And then Michael Harrington, who wrote The Other America, at one point said to both of us, why don't you go up to this office on West 57th Street and help Bayard Rustin, who's working on the Montgomery protest? And Tom Kahn and I walked into an office. One part of it was as big as this podium, and there was a little office on the side. And in that room was Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker. They had an organization called In Friendship, and it was in friendship with the Montgomery bus. We were not calling it boycott yet. We were calling it protest to make it legal, and they were raising money. And one of our first jobs, because there was going to be a rally with Jackie Robinson speaking, but 50,000 leaflets had been printed with the wrong date, was to take pens and change Wednesday to Thursday. And Bayard and Ella Baker would sit there, and we would all go Wednesday to Thursday. And into this office would come other volunteers, people, Bob Moses, who was a hero in the civil rights movement, and other people. And Bayard, I think, knew he had to keep us interested because we wouldn't come back. But also, he was an absolutely born teacher. So what he did is sometimes he sang freedom songs. Sometimes he told Con and me what to read about being Black. He was always doing something, but every few minutes, either Ella or Bayard would run into the back office and they would say, Martin's on the phone. And they would go and they would talk to Martin Luther King. And I had some, and they made a decision that somebody had to go south. Dr. King was in Montgomery. He was, I think, 27 years old. I mean, it was his first church. He was discovering himself. They foisted him into the leadership of the Montgomery protests because he was the new guy in town, so that people didn't have anything about him. And of course, when people heard him preach, they knew there was something going on. So Ella was to go south. So there we are. And Con and I and Moses and other people became members of the Bayard Rustin Marching Society. Anyway, the real point that I really want to get to is Bayard and Al Shanker. Bayard not only took on in the film world every dangerous question, but he was an incredibly courageous man, physically and intellectually. Ocean Hill-Brownsville was a disastrous event in New York City. Somebody quickly tell me the year.
67, 68.
67, 68. A group of activists in Ocean Hill-Brownsville came up with a concept of community control as opposed to due process unions. It was a very militant and attractive sounding slogan, as a lot of slogans are, community control. And Al at first sort of negotiated. He tried to negotiate. The negotiations fell through. And ultimately, teachers were fired in Ocean Hill-Brownsville without due process. They were just kicked out. And there came a fight of, do you defend them or not? Phil Randolph, when Bayard went to him and told him what was going on, Mr. Randolph just said, are my brothers and sisters not getting due process in the union? Bayard said, no. They said, what's the problem? We have to support them. Bayard tried to explain that Jimmy Baldwin, every sort of Black non-trade unionist in the city, was supporting community control. By the way, if you ask any of them today, they'll tell you community control was a disaster. Those of you who knew Al Shanker and heard Al Shanker know he was a little abrupt and brusque. And he'd say something that really you shouldn't say. So what he said during Ocean Hill-Brownsville was, I'm against mob control. Well, every Black person within sight shuddered at that. And I must say, Bayard ran down. We were then to Al's office and said to him, you cannot say that. When you say that, you offend me. And I don't even know whether Bayard had to explain to Al what he meant. But the fact of the matter is, Al listened and took it seriously. And what remains from that incident is the depth of their friendship. In the campaign to organize, to get collective bargaining for the AFT, Al went to jail, and Bayard had a collection from various people for money to bail Al out. And obviously it's a symbolic collection, but a check came from Martin Luther King, a check which, by the way, some of you may know, Al never cashed, and which he had in his wallet his whole life. So there was a historic relationship.
of, many times in kind of talkbacks of the movie right now, there's a lot of focus on Bayard's sexuality and how that stopped him or kept him, and you see that in the movie, kind of pulled him back from the leadership. He couldn't speak at the march. There were several leaders who wanted him not to be involved. Part of the brilliance of this panel is that you see Bayard as a trade unionist and as the activist who actually helped create a generation of trade unionists. So as someone who, came in the 80s, what I heard was a lot of these stories. To finish Rachelle's story on Ocean Hill-Brownsville, both Sandy, who was then the president of the UFT, before she became the president of the AFT, and myself and others, we wanted to heal the scars of Ocean Hill. Herb Daughtry and Reverend Al Sharpton walked into the new AFT, then new building at 52 Broadway, and they said, as we were planning a strike, yes, illegal, but a strike nonetheless, against the city of New York and Michael Bloomberg. And they said, in front of a huge crowd of people, we weren't with you in 1968, but we are with you now. The end of it was that we worked on the relationships for all of those years. But one of the through lines, and this is where I want to get to, is that Clay and Loretta and Rachelle and Sandy and Arthur Barnes and so many others, we were not going to let others divide our communities. And we ultimately, and this is, I want to, in Bayard's tradition, Loretta and Clay and others in New York, I don't know if Anthony Harmon is here, Hazel Dukes, we worked at it. We were not going to let anyone divide these historic communities, labor and civil rights community, to divide us. And I want to just turn to the two of you because you have been part of this, and Rachelle is, shaking her head. You've been part of this as we not only healed those rifts, but actually fought to make these communities, our communities, closer.
Well, I'll pick up from there. Barbara Van Blake, who was our Civil and Human Rights chair, introduced me to Bayard Rustin. I was an activist in AFT, back home, BTU. Barbara was an activist in our own home, Duval County. She had produced in Duval County what Bayard had been teaching, how the community and the union could work together and make a difference in the political world. Barbara was president of the A. Philip Randolph, but she also was a union member. She was a teacher in Duval County. But every politician came to the A. Philip Randolph for support and get out the vote. And when I went down there to work for AFT to help out, I met Barbara. And Barbara was a teacher, president of the A. Philip Randolph, and put together such a strong program and elected school board members, elected city council persons in that district, and they had no collective bargaining rights, but Duval County had them because the people that they put in supported them. And then Al hired Barbara as chair. I became a vice president and became chair of the Civil and Human Rights Department. And she introduced me to Bayard. Bayard was a very strong man. I got the opportunity through Bayard to meet Mr. Randolph. I went to Mr. Randolph's apartment and for 2 hours heard the story, his life story of what he did on the sleeping car porters and how he worked and what came and how this institution, the A. Philip Randolph, we were nonpartisan. And he was very clear. I could hear his voice now when he said it. We're not Democrats and we're not Republicans. We're going to be nonpartisan. But we're going to have our people out to vote. And we're going to educate them. I got hooked. And I went back home. I've been president of the A. Philip Randolph in Baltimore for 45 years. Bayard was a thinker, a strategist with me. I remember the Institute was run mostly by the people who gave the money. They were all on the board. Al Shanker was treasurer. UAW president was somebody else. CWA was sitting up there. And all of us, and I was one of the leaders, we presidents of our chapters back home, well, we don't have enough to say about this board. And how come they making all the decisions for us when we go to the conference? We don't have a convention because we're not a union. We're a nonpartisan organization. So we have a conference every year. But we was feeling like it was a union because we were there fussing. So Bayard said to me, look, Lorretta, I'm tired of you coming up here every year talking this same trash to me. And I'm not going to tell you what he said because he cussed a lot. So he said, we're going to come up with an idea of how we can settle this. He came up with setting up a regional structure. Yes. And from that region, each person that we put up to represent us, north, east, south, west, would be on the board and be a board member. Well, we all grinning now. We all had something to say. So we have a regional structure. We couldn't have a union structure. We don't elect our officers. This was Bayard at work. And he did it in a way. And at the night at the awards banquet, when he said, all of you that's been complaining to me, I hope you're feeling good because you've been on my goddamn nerves for years. The concept of what Bayard did, I didn't know it early on when I came to the march in 1963 when they coordinated, was a part of community versus union. They had a union guy, Mr. Bradley, who put the buses out there for us to come to Washington. And when I got to meet Bayard, I was so in awe that I was meeting the guy who put that together. And then one of my mentors over here, when I came into AFT, Rachelle Horowitz, I found out later that she was the one that did the coordination. So I was in my world. And continuing the effort, I'm so happy that I can be a part of this movie and the fact that Bayard is now being identified for the work he did.
Because what you're hearing here in Rachelle and in Lorretta and in Clay, you're hearing a living history that we may not ever again have the opportunity to do. And I think it's important to dwell on it in Black History Month, which is American history. Amen. If we don't tell these oral histories of who we are and what has happened, we're not going to have it to tell. And so that is why I am dwelling on it and why this podcast may be longer than many of the others that we do. So Clay.
Thank you, Randy. Let me first say to all of you, I sit here absolutely in awe of having first been invited to be a part of this discussion. And I thank you, President Weingarten, for doing just that.
When did you ever call me President
Well, we out in public. I was trying to be proper, goddammit. I tell you what, Randy has been a friend and AFT has been longstanding, as you heard from the history from the speakers before me, for the A. Philip Randolph Institute, because there were times when we didn't have a place to stay. And Sandy Felder, you know what I'm talking about, Anthony. Sandy Felder came through across the park and said, why are you worrying so much? We didn't go anywhere. UFT is still here, AFT is still here, and you've got a home as long as we are. And that was years later. But let me go back just a little bit, because although my sisters are so beautiful and they speak so well, I was 15 when I first got the bite. 15 years old, living in Philadelphia with my uncle and my aunt, because my mom didn't want me to go back to South Carolina to finish high school. We had just gotten in, my dad was in the Navy, just gotten transferred back to the East Coast and was headed for South Carolina. In the house with my aunt, who I could not stand at all. And she deserved for me not to stand her, because she was a mean, old, hateful woman. But my uncle, who was just such a straightforward man, proud of his dignity, and taught me to understand the importance of being Black and proud at the same time, was an encouragement to me. But I would sneak and listen to a station from Philadelphia, WDAS, on the radio at night. And there was a DJ, Georgie Woods, who would do the talking at the time. And he was talking about this march that was going to happen in Washington, D.C. And I heard them playing snippets of this resonating voice of Asa Philip Randolph, and he had that deep baritone that just sounded like you want to do something special just because you heard him, right? It sounded like the voice of God from the movies, right? But then you heard Dr. King, and you heard all of these other voices that at 15, I was like, I gotta go. Now, I came up during the time when your signal for being in the house was a street light. If you wasn't in that house by the time that light started to come on, you knew that you were going to meet either the hand, the belt, or the shoe coming through the door, plain and simple. And my aunt loved for me to be late, but anyway, I digress. But when I heard those voices, I knew that I didn't really have an option, because there was something about the pride and the dignity that came from just listening to the voices that made you want to do some stuff. Yeah. And they gave the date, and they gave the location, and I didn't have no money, but I knew I was going to get from Philadelphia to Washington some kind of way. And on faith, I was able to put together babysitting money to get a Greyhound ticket, Greyhound bus. So y'all know what that is, right? To get to Washington, D.C. Got on the bus, and the one thing that I knew, if you saw a sister with a greasy brown bag, you are right. Because in that bag was some chicken, some pound cake, somebody had a jar of Kool-Aid somewhere. And it wasn't with all the fancy names. It was either grape or red. And if you were smart, you sat next to those folks with them greasy bags. So I waited until my uncle went to work that morning, because he worked for PSE&G. And when he left, my aunt was lazy. She would lay in the bed and tell me what I had to do around the house. But I digress one more time. I promise I won't do it no more. But when he left, I left. I went down to that Greyhound bus station, took that bus to Washington, D.C., found me a sister with a greasy bag, sat next to her, ate so well, all the way to Washington, and got there and didn't know what the heck I was going to do. It was the most amazing sight I had ever seen in my entire life. A sea of people like you could not believe, of all colors, shapes, and sizes. And you had to have this tassel-y labeled thing from the church that you were traveling with or from the organization that you were traveling with in order to gain access to the main space. You know what I'm talking about. Both of y'all do. I didn't have nothing except a greasy mouth at that time. But I wasn't alone because there were other folks that were 14, 15, and 16 that had taken a chance. And I started looking up in the trees. And that's where we got the name from, the bird children. Because we couldn't go down to see, but there were some awesome trees that we could climb and see the faces and hear the voices and all the speeches as they were being made. And that was the awesomeness that started for me at 15, to know that there was work to be done and I had to be a part of it. I got a chance to see Rustin. And oh my God, he did not speak as Randy was talking about earlier, but you could tell he was running stuff. He had this board, clipboard. You know what I'm talking about. And he had maybe a gazillion pencils stuck a little bit everywhere. You could see how he was grabbing pencils and whatever as he was directing folks all across everywhere. I was like, that man is magical. And I watched how all of the others with big names and reputations were looking at him and listening to what he had to say. But he never got in front of a camera. He never picked up a microphone to do anything. He just made it happen. And as I listened to a very young Dr. King talk about why we had to be there, and as I watched Randolph standing in his magnificent way, I was like, Lord Jesus, I got to do something with this. And then the time came to go home and get on the bus and go back to my aunt's house. By this time, everyone had been worried and scared about what had happened. My uncle didn't talk to me. He just gave me the whipping that I expected. My mother was doing sleep-in work in New York because my dad was going back out to sea. So I knew I was going to get another one when she came to Philly to find out what had happened. I got that second whipping. But that very next summer, she took me down to South Carolina because by then a house was built. And I had an opportunity to work on my first real organizing campaign. And in that organizing campaign, at a place called Manhattan Shirt Factory, there were those same kinds of voices, the same kinds of struggles being talked about. And those men were being lifted in those conversations. So I knew I had found a home. The labor movement was what I wanted to do. Later, I found out it was UAW who paid for the sound system so that we could hear. Say it again.
And the ILGWU.
My parent union, the ILGWU, provided the stands and the podiums and a few of the microphones. UAW had a little bit more money than ILGW. They had those great big old microphones, we call them speakers, that were all over everywhere. And I watched the unity between community and the labor movement and the religious sector. And it became real. I was used to preachers hollering at me. I mean, because they knew how to make you jump up and holler hallelujah in a heartbeat. But these were trade unions, organizers and strategists who could do the very same thing. And it was amazing to see the young people there. I was not an outsider at 15 and 16. I was recruited at that age by the message that got taught. And I never forgot it. Because then, as I became an adult, this woman that I'm sitting next to came to me and said, we need you at the APRI. I didn't know Lorretta from a hole in the stump. But Lorretta talked to me about names and people that I had seen as a teenager and idolized. And then I met Barbara Van Blake, who she called Black Black. And I was being taught in a formalized way how to organize the thoughts. I got to meet folks from the AFT who made school and other kinds of structured organizations a place to do the kinds of things that you got a chance to see a Rustin do, to hear a Randolph talk about. And it was, again, establishing what home was. Then I met this one right here, who started yelling at me again about all the stuff that needed to be done. So the mix between the two movements and the one goal became so very clear. And it wasn't a choice. It was a calling that if you had ears and a heart, you knew what your next step had to be. But that's how I got to the movement.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.